Let me go to Alimadi. Milton Allimadi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, my brother.
Now, Alimadi, why were you trying to stop your compatriot Sam Kahamba Kutesa from holding that important position?
I think it's even easier for me to answer the question now because Dr. Jonah has laid out the record of Africans with stellar credentials that have served in that position. The first one from Ghana, and then we had Angie Brooks, the first and only female from Liberia who served in that position. We have Dr. Ahmed Salim. We'd have Joseph Garba. We've had people with impeccable credentials who served in that position. And then we have Mr. Sam Kutesa. So Mr. Sam Kutesa are joining that list of individuals. Unfortunately, it diminishes that list. It diminishes their achievements, and it reflects very poorly on the United Nations organization. And we can discuss Mr. Kutesa as foreign minister of Uganda and how Uganda's policies really do not adhere to any of the principles of the United Nations. And we can also discuss Mr. Kutesa, the individual. Briefly, Uganda. As you and I know, Uganda was found liable in 2005 for war crimes in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, massacres, plunder of resources. 7 million Congolese have died as a result of that war. And Uganda was assessed $6 to $10 billion to pay to the government in Kinshasa. That money has not yet been paid. And in fact, the International Criminal Court launched an investigation that was covered in the Wall Street Journal. June 8, 2006, the article said Uganda's president himself, General Museveni, contacted then Secretary General Kofi Annan and told him to block that investigation. Now, how can we turn around today, given those sort of facts, and have Sam Kutesa, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Uganda, become president of the General Assembly of the United Nations? It means we are not taking the United Nations seriously. It means the UN is not taking itself seriously. And we as Africans, at some point, we have to say no. We have to make our voices heard that we oppose rewarding this kind of activity.
But what about the fact that despite your opinion, what about the fact that the African Union found him competent, found him the most suitable son of the soil to essentially, really, to do the job?
Well, first of all, Shaka, unfortunately, these are actually not my opinions. These are established facts. I mean, the International Court of Justice had a trial, a hearing, and came to that conclusion. So that, with all due respect, they're actually not my opinion. And then in terms of the African Union clearly did not vet this individual. Because if they had done any vetting at all, they would have found out that in 1999, he was censored, serious censor by the Uganda parliament. These are lawmakers from his own political party that looked at the facts and found that he had committed a serious conflict of interest. He diverted resources from the country's national airline, Uganda Airlines, into his own private company, Entebbe Handling Services, and caused Uganda Airlines to collapse. Him, according to the transcripts in the parliamentary proceeding, him and the brother of the president, General Salim Saleh. This is not my opinion. This is what the parliament in Uganda came to the conclusion. If they had vetted him, they would have found out that when Uganda hosted the Commonwealth Conference in 2007, hundreds of millions of dollars went missing. One estimate was $150 million. They would have found out that the British government considered blocking Mr. Kutesa's visa. And how do we know that? Because it was in a letter written by Jerry Lanier, who was the United States ambassador to Uganda. And he wrote a confidential memo which was published in WikiLeaks. It was dated January 13, 2010. And he said the British government is considering a visa ban on Mr. Kutesa because it's believed he and other ministers stole at least $27 million. If the African Union had looked at these set of facts, I doubt they would have selected him to be the candidate to represent Africa as president of the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Now, what about the fact that Mr. Kutesa has never, in fact, been convicted by a court of law in Uganda? In fact, he goes out to say that, it is people like you, essentially, who are trying to malign his name. I'll come to you after the break. Let me come to you quickly, Milton. Of course, you had that, but you also had a little bit earlier from a veteran UN top official telling you that when it comes to vetting, that sounds like a foreign language, so to speak, and as far as some of these international organizations are concerned. But let me frankly come to one person that comes to mind, and that is Jean Ping of Gabon, who apparently was a very successful and respected president of the UNGA, and later alone, in fact, became the chairman, of course, as you remember, of the African Union, despite the fact that when he became president of UNGA, he came from Gabon, which was under Omar Bongo. You could have said dictator Omar Bongo. You could obviously have said that was a country that had a democracy deficit. How come he was able to perform his role?
Shaka, this is how I'll answer it. I doubt that the U.S. ambassador to Gabon wrote a letter similar to this one, which the U.S. ambassador to Uganda wrote. And I'll read it very briefly. The UK is considering visa restrictions for senior Ugandan officials guilty of misusing $27 million allocated to the November 2007 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Their review of the CHOGM expenditures, at least a dozen government ministers and several ministers, including Kutesa, Vice President Bukenya, Public Works Minister Nasasira, have been implicated in the CHOGM scandal. We regard Kutesa's corruption as egregious. And this is not coming from these so-called enemies that he's talking about. This is coming from the United States ambassador, and the United States is one of the countries that actually supports Uganda. So this is a very serious matter. I don't think if the AU had looked at this,
egregious, of course,
they would have considered him.
Egregious, of course, would almost mean outrageous. But what about the United States itself? What about the Secretary of State, John Kelly, the boss of that ambassador that you are talking about? Are you suggesting that he did not access that letter? How come he did not, for example, deny him the visa to come to the United States?
Thank you, Shaka. And now you ask the more serious questions, which actually raises the issue of international politics and what the UN is all about. As Dr. Jonah indicated, in these instances, these are political decisions. And he gave an example of when there was a certain candidate that was not favorable to the West, and that candidate was blocked by promoting another candidate. In this instance, we know that basically, because Uganda provides troops to stabilize Somalia, Uganda has a blank check. And I think it's because of that consideration that the egregious corruption, which was mentioned by the U.S. ambassador himself, was ignored in this instance. And that's how I would answer that question.
What about the voices of two New York senators on record, also who said perhaps he shouldn't actually get the job precisely because he comes from a country that has recently signed a bill into law that, according to them, discriminates against the LGBT?
Absolutely. And I think it was very important for those two senators, Senator Chuck Schumer, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and in fact, Congressman Charles Rangel also made a very strong statement. And I think that should be taken seriously. I think going forward, it's not going to be easy for Mr. Kutesa to function. If Mr. Kutesa was truly a person of conscience, as his supporters indicate that he is, he should actually do the right thing and step aside. The UN laws actually allow for the election of another candidate going forward.